In the aftermath of the Catilinarian conspiracy, when the Senate was deliberating whether or not to execute the conspirators, Julius Caesar gave a speech that warned his colleagues about the risks of political innovation, of breaking with constitutional tradition. He warned that someday there would come a politician who wasn't a Cicero and who would aim at a more royal kind of power. And that man was Julius Caesar himself. That's the irony of Caesar's speech in the Histories of Sallust. Julius Caesar would represent the figure who brought the Roman Republic to an end and inaugurated what we can call the Imperial Period of Rome. And so in this lesson, we begin to turn from the Republican period of Rome, the period when Rome was res publica, ruled without a king since 509 BC, with its mixed constitution, with its magistrates forming a royal element, with its Senate forming an aristocratic, and its assemblies forming a popular or democratic element in the Constitution. This system, this balanced constitution, had been unbalanced since the age of Tiberius Gracchus. There had always been tension within the Roman political and social order. But from the age of Tiberius Gracchus began a series of civil wars that turned into social conflicts over the distribution of wealth and property between the senatorial classes who wished to control the ship of state through the Senate and their enormous wealth, and through the common people who inhabited the great cities like Rome, who staffed the imperial armies, and who were often desperately at the mercy of the wealthy landowning classes. And these tensions would continue to manifest themselves in a series of civil wars that would recur again and again, reaching their climax in the lifetime of Julius Caesar, who defeated the forces under the command of the general Pompey the Great, once the greatest military figure in Rome, until he himself was overshadowed by the rise of his rival, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was a great populist leader. In fact, he comes out of the tradition of Tiberius Gracchus, even, although less radically, that of Catiline. Julius Caesar represented the interests of the common man in Roman society. Julius Caesar represented the victory of the popular element over the oligarchic faction of the Senate. Although Caesar himself was of illustrious ancestry, he, more than any political figure in his time, had the support of the common person and represented the triumph of the common interests in the Roman state. And so when we imagine the end of the Republic and the rise of the monarchies, although it would not be a monarchy in name, but only in fact, imagine this as the triumph of the common person over the senatorial factions, over the oligarchy of the Senate. For that is how Julius Caesar rose to power. Julius Caesar had himself declared perpetual dictator. In fact, in the Roman constitutional system, dictator is an emergency office that can be used in desperate times of conflict, a 6-month term of office. So there's precedent for a dictator. But Caesar has himself declared perpetual dictator. Again, it's one of these kinds of constitutional innovations that we see in the last century of the Roman Republic. Caesar had himself declared perpetual dictator. But again, just as Tiberius Gracchus had been assassinated in a senatorial coup by a band of senators who believed that he was aspiring after royal power, so too rumor began to spread through Rome that Julius Caesar was intent on claiming himself king. And on March 15th in the year 44 BC, he too was assassinated, stabbed to death by a band of senatorial conspirators. But the death of Caesar did not see the rebirth of the Republic. It did not see even a return to dominance of the Senate. Instead, after the death of Caesar, there was another round of civil wars that were won very quickly by the supporters of Caesar, his adopted son, Octavius, and his lieutenant, Mark Antony, who would come to dominate the Roman state. Mark Antony would assassinate our friend Cicero for opposing his tyranny, but never again would the Senate truly dominate Roman politics. Ultimately, Mark Antony and Octavian would struggle amongst themselves for control of the Roman state, and in 31, Octavian would defeat Antony at a climactic naval battle at Actium and would become the sole ruler of the Roman world. Octavian would eventually have himself declared Augustus. He would take on the name Augustus, which means the Holy One, the Revered One, the Sacred One. He would take a title, Imperator, which meant general, a man with absolute military command. He would accrue other titles, Princeps, the Prince, the First Citizen, but he would never take the title of Rex, King. Nevertheless, Augustus established a monarchy in effect. He left the Senate and the assemblies in existence, but in reality, these were no more than what has been called a constitutional facade. And in fact, Augustus, the Roman emperor, was the true seat of Roman power. And for the next 5 centuries, what we call the Imperial Period, Rome would be ruled by a monarch, not a king, but an emperor. And so this period of Roman history is called the Imperial Period. It's one of the great periods of Roman history. Even though Rome was no longer a republic, she was an extraordinary state, an empire seated in Rome, seated in Italy, but that would control the entire Mediterranean world, one of the history's great empires, lasting for centuries. It was a period of extraordinary prosperity, and it was a period of law. We call this period the classical period of Roman law, the famous Roman law system, which has influenced across the millennia nearly all other Western legal systems, flourishes as never before because the Roman emperors rule according to the rule of law. They are careful, punctilious in their observance of the rule of law. They place tremendous authority in the figure of the jurist, that is, the figure of legal professionals who can interpret the law and help the monarchs, help the emperors themselves create and shape Roman law. So the age of monarchy, these popular monarchies that emerge out of the late Republic, are also the greatest age of Roman law. They're an age of the rule of law and an age of individual freedom. There's a passage in classical Roman law that says, freedom, libertas, is the natural power of a man to do as he pleases. Think about that definition in terms of some conversations that we've had throughout this course. That is a classic liberal definition of freedom. Libertas is a man's power of living as he pleases. And that's the ideal of the rule of law under the Roman emperors. They believe that they protect the freedom of ordinary people across this empire by enforcing a law that protects their liberty, their right to do as they please. Think back to the conversations we have, going back to the Greeks, to Isaiah Berlin's 2 concepts of liberty. One, a positive kind of liberty, power of the citizen to govern himself. The other, a negative liberty, the absence of coercion, the ability to do as you please. And this is the model of freedom that is embodied in Roman law and that flourishes in the Roman Empire under the rule of the great emperors who rule this Mediterranean empire.